Okay, welcome everyone. Okay, so welcome to Parenting During Corona. It's quite a difficult time because interesting times. We haven't really had times like this before, at least in living memory. So it's a little bit different than it regularly is. We are spending so much time with our families that I think the point is that it accentuates the challenges and the opportunities that we have. So we're privileged to bring you a great panel this evening. I'm going to introduce the panel one by one. I always like to say in every crisis there's an opportunity, and these three are really an opportunity for us to tap into. So we have three different perspectives. We have Professor Gersch, who I must say, we did the flyer, and Professor Gersch has more letters after his name than you can imagine. In fact, the graphic designer actually told me, is there any chance we could cut down the number of letters after his name so we can fit them on the flyer? To which point I said, we actually already have. So we have Professor Gersch, who's a real expert in the field of educational psychology, child psychology. We also have our very own Vanessa Broder. I say our very own because Seed Manchester is really built from Vanessa Broder, who's an extremely talented educator, and now is also one of the facilitators of a particular type of emotional well-being training, which is called iHeart. Did I get that right, Vanessa?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad. iHeart, which is built around innate resilience and things like that. And we also have our very own leader, Rabbi Herman, who is, he doesn't like us to call him an expert. But in terms of everyday parenting, I consider him an expert. He is the co-author with Professor Gersch of the book Everyday Parenting for Everyday Parents, which is a bestseller. And he is a mentor of numerous parents and has tremendous experience in the field. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first question out, which has been sent. And if anyone does have any questions that's watching, then they can either text 07444 472216. That's 07444 472 216. It will come up across the screen at some point. You can text questions to there, or you can put questions in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube Live. And we will receive those questions, and we'll try and, to the best of our ability, deal with the questions that we have. And please feel free to put any comments on, let us know where you are, etc. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is one which is quite important to me, I must say. My daughter, who is 13, thrives on her social life, as most 13-year-old daughters do. She's currently finding the lockdown very difficult, with Zoom being a poor compensation for hanging out for real. She's become much more moody of lately, and I'm concerned about her emotional well-being. What are the signs to look out for, and how can we help her through this time? And that question will start with Professor Gersch.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and a big welcome to everybody here. And I just wanted to say, as a preface to quite a few of these questions, that at the moment there's lots of talk about following the science and listening to experts, which is a good thing for experts. But I really want to begin today by saying that actually you, as the parents, are totally the expert. Nobody really knows your child like you know your child. And although we've got some questions here, I can't go anywhere near to knowing and loving and caring for your child just like the way you do. So I say this, that I start from this proposition that actually the key expert in this whole situation of dealing with your children and your particular children and their requirements, that you are the actual expert. Well, if we've got a daughter age 13 missing her friends and so on, I think what the first thing I'd say is she's not alone. And when it comes to moodiness, I know a lot of you will tell me that at the age of 13, again, this is not a particularly unusual behavior or response. But I think probably the most important thing I'd say is that what we need to do is really listen deeply, listen carefully, and acknowledge her real issues and anxieties. We need to give her plenty of time and space to talk. By that, I mean that we don't do the talking, we do the listening. And I think it's very important that the ethos of that position when we're listening to children is right. The time has to be right, the atmosphere has to be right, the location has to be right, it has to be uninterrupted and private. And we all know that when we have quick conversations at the time of the agony, of the time of the angst, when that's happening, that's not necessarily the best. So it's a difficult age. We're going through adolescence at 13, and we can well understand why missing out on social friends is probably, I've spoken to a lot of children recently, most of them my own grandparents, to be fair, my own grandchildren, to be fair, but it is true to say that one of the things they miss, even more than school, is their friends. So I know it's a poor alternative and a second best, but things like Zoom parties, social time, board games played on Zoom, telephoning, having a friends hour are all very important. I know it isn't like the real thing, but it is better than nothing. And I think it's very, very, very important that children through this stage stay in touch with their friends, they have friends time, and they communicate with their friends in whatever way they can. Now, you mentioned about the symptoms of, mental health and so on. Well, we do know that some children, not a lot, probably less than about 5%, have a sustained depression. And when children get very, very depressed, then obviously we should get help. But I would say that for the 95% of children that go through this situation, we know that many of those moodinesses and symptoms and so on will pass, and particularly if it's a short time. But the sort of things we should look out for actually are things like sadness, irritability and anger. Anger is sometimes quite hard because it's hard to equate that with somebody feeling upset or down. It tends to make one angry. But we should see through that and see perhaps a child is really upset and has something that's worrying them and deal with it more as an anxiety. Apart from that, you could get irritability, tempers, changes in weight or eating behavior, sleeping can change, and so on. I think where there's a lot of negative talk or talk about a bad self-image or loss of confidence, again, all those things need to be dealt with and the child needs reassurance. The one that I would be worried about, to be honest, would be if a child spoke of hurting themselves or wanting to hurt themselves, or in those rare terrible events even did so. There's no question then that one should seek professional help initially through the GP. But as I said, what we're talking about is a 13-year-old losing her friends for a short time, understandably moody. And I think as 95% of people are going to experience this, unfortunately, I can't hear you telling me that that is correct, but I hope you're saying that many of you might experience that. I think we have to go through, and our main aim is to come out alive and to come out so that it's part of experience, part of learning, and it's just part of growing up. I think I'm gonna handing over to Vanessa now.
I wanted to add something actually. I wanted to say that I think it's an amazing opportunity to have some to sort of look at the language in our home and to check that it's a language of emotional well-being. I don't know, we use language, there's so much going on in our homes at the moment, there's so many dynamics, but to have that as a focus in my mind, I know that this is an amazing opportunity for me to be setting a context in my home for emotional well-being. So when I say that, I mean, like, I don't just mean dealing with my 13-year-old's moods, I mean dealing with all the children in my home and all the dynamics in my home. There's like, I remember once Rabbi Herman teaching me, who was my teacher years ago and still is my teacher, he was talking about when we talk about things that are difficult for children, introduce them in times that are not emotional. So for instance, if we're going to be talking about death, then we would talk about when the spider dies. What an amazing opportunity that is, that we see a spider who's dead. And it's an opportunity to talk about death before we actually have to face something that is like the height of kind of an emotional storm in the house. So I would say that just in neutral times, not just focused on the 13-year-old, that we're talking in language of emotional health, and it becomes the way that we see each other. When you said, Gary, that she's having moods, I think it would just be important to teach my children that moods are really normal. Like, we have that, especially 13-year-olds. Like, you know, irrespective of corona, she could be having moods anyway. It could be nothing to do with corona at all. Like, physiologically, teenagers have moods. That's normal. I think one of the things that teenagers are most afraid of, and I remember being most afraid of it when I was a teenager, was that maybe I'm not normal. Like, what do we know? It looks like everybody else is managing, everybody else is okay, and we know the pain that's going on, the confusion that's going on inside us, and we don't feel normal. And I would want, as a parent, to be really feeding back to my child that, you know, a healthy human being will go in and out of their well-being. Our well-being is within us, and sometimes we have access to it, and other times we don't. And that's just what it means. It's a little bit like the analogy of the sun. You know, the sun is always present. It never goes anywhere. But if you live in Manchester, you don't often see it. You do recently. Mm-hmm. But generally, you don't often see it. It goes behind the clouds, but we don't doubt for 1 minute that it's there. So I feel like us as human beings are like that too. You know, we have our resilience, our emotional well-being is within us. And then we'll have a stormy mind. In fact, we call it a thought storm in our home. You know, that we go in and out of thought storms. And when we're in a thought storm, we lose access to our emotional well-being. And she should know that that's the way I am as a human being, the way my husband is a human, every single human being on the planet. That's just what we're gonna have to ride. That's the excitement of life, riding that. But trusting that it's there and using language in the home that I identify you as that sunshine. That's a really powerful paradigm to kind of set as the context in your home, partly because it's true. Like, the child is the sunshine, that is the essential child. And everything else is the child struggling in confusion and in a very stormy mind. And as the stormy mind clears, they come back to themselves. So language like, oh, I see you came back to your sunshine, or hang on, I can't speak right now because I'm in a cloudy moment. That kind of thing teaches a child about moods and it normalizes them. And so they can become comfortable with the human experience, and takes a lot off their minds when that's the context that they experience their emotional well-being in. You want me to keep going? I can add more.
No. Gary, could I just add 30 seconds worth? Gary, can I add 30 seconds worth?
No, I heard, I'm thinking.
Okay, I think it's important. You know, a lot of teenagers, their self-esteem is built around their social interaction. And I think it's important that we as parents find opportunities to reinforce their self-esteem in different ways, to replenish their self-esteem. And that's important, whether it's complimenting them, finding areas where they're good, finding opportunities where we can endorse them. That's really, really, really important, because most of their self-esteem that is normally taken from the social circle is disabled. And therefore, it's vital that we as parents look for those opportunities to continue to build and reinforce their self-esteem.
Okay, if I can, just from my own experience, I'm sure many of us are aware that we said a teenager. So teenagers are getting younger by the day. Let's say it that way. So at what age would you say that we need? This is primarily directed at Vanessa. At what age would you say that we need to start using that emotional language, that emotional? Oh, I can't hear you.
As soon as we understand clearly from when they're babies, like if we I mean, it's like with all sorts, with all teaching, you want to be teaching your children what's true about the human experience, about life. So, and the earlier we start, the lighter it is, the more that, you know, when a child grows up knowing that that's normal, knowing that that's part of the human experience, then they're not so thrown by it when it hits them. so I don't think there is a age. I don't know what age do you start teaching children anything that's true? We begin as early as we can. I think that the key thing is as early as we see what's true. You know, as if it's always the same with parenting. It's like we have to understand something ourselves first. We can only teach what we have to give. So if we're comfortable with the fact that that's part of the human experience, if we understand that as a human being, we're built for life, we're built to be able to do life. It's our God-given legacy internally that we are resilient, we have well-being, and we will lose access to it when we have a stormy mind, and we'll come and we'll return to it. And we live like that. We know it's like that. Every one of us sort of loses access to our ease and our sort of our deeper, more profound sense of being able to handle life. But then we come back to it again. The more we see that and understand that that's the essence of a human being, then nothing can take that away from us. Nothing can take that security away from us. Like a young child needs to know that. A young child is tantruming, you know, oh, wow, I see you lost yourself for a bit. So nice to have you back. I missed you, you know, that they identify themselves as the sunshine, not the cloud. It's very powerful and really important for us in life.
Okay, amazing. Thank you very much. Lots to think about. Okay, so I'm at this point. I'm going to ask. Actually someone to join us, or not on the panel, but to present a question. So, is Lisa available? Is Lisa available to present the question?
Hi, yes, I am. Hi. Hi. Nice to see you. So I wanted to ask a question about homeschooling. I feel like I'm not doing very well with my children's homeschooling at the moment, and basically my children are doing very, very little indeed in terms of their schooling at the moment. And every time I try and get them to do some work, it doesn't last for very long, and they end up going to watch television, going to play on whatever gadget they can get their hands on, and basically doing anything except for their schoolwork. Before Pesach, I was kind of quite laid back about it, but now the new term has started. And I would be grateful for some ideas as to how to sort of get them to focus, and also where, you know, I suppose to know how bothered to be about it. I'm a bit concerned that they will sort of miss out on some learning that they need to do and preparation for exams and things that come up in the future. So just looking for a bit of help on that one, really.
Okay, let's start with the professor on this one as well. Oh, we've lost you, Professor. Hold on. Oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Lisa, isn't it? Lisa, you wouldn't be alone on that one. I think a lot of people would be having a similar issue. And in fact, I think a lot of people have become very respectful of teachers, you know, the magic of how they do that all the time. But to be honest, we're not teachers when we're at home with our families and suddenly we're asked to change role. It's a big ask for parents to do this. And I think parents are doing amazingly well. But two or three points I'd like to make. I think I said at the beginning that you know your child best. And I think we need to find out with a discussion with our children, and you need to remember from your knowledge of them, what are their distinct gifts and how they learn best. Every child can surprise us so many times by the things they learn. So just before coming here, I decided to ask quite a few children about what they were learning. And actually, it wasn't always about school. One young man told me that he decided to learn sign language. Another younger child told me he was learning about birds. Another one was doing jurisprudence at the Harvard Law School, although he was only, you know, in his secondary school. People do all sorts of different things. I think what we have to do is be very flexible. I do think we need a structure, though, all of us. We need a good structure for our day, and we do need to have boundaries. But I think there are times when we kind of look aside and we don't try too hard, and we do as much as we possibly can. But we do know that short, punctuated lessons with lots of time following and free time, a little bit of work. We know from, you know, if you have to do a big job, you don't want to be working night and day. It has to be punctuated. We do know from all the evidence that rewards help, prizes help. Some people call them bribes, but certificates help. little things like that. Demonstrations help in terms of them showing off their skills to other people. I would certainly sit down with your son or children and try and work out, negotiate, using a positive approach, a structure that works for them. Now, it's true that when children are about 15, young people about 15, their sleep pattern physiologically changes, and everything we do in our society just ignores that. But many young people prefer to sleep late and work in the afternoon. And I say, go with it. Let them get up a bit later. In fact, now we can do that. And in the afternoon, maybe they do their work and maybe a little bit in the evening. But I think we need to negotiate a structure in the nicest possible way, explaining that it is good for them to have a structure. They can't sit in their pajamas on their iPad all day. It's just not healthy and not good. We need to build little achievable, realistic targets, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, a little bit more. And there's nothing like having a list that you tick off. I mean, I think a lot of us as adults like that, the feeling of achievement, plenty of rewards, plenty of praise. And remember, you are not a school. Involve the school by all means. Sometimes it can be helpful to have a word with the school that they can phone up and the teacher can be encouraging. But I don't think we should beat ourselves up about it. And remember, children learn in many ways and they need certain space on their own. So I think it's about finding a good balance between a structured day, some work, lots of rewards, and then some free time, and allowing the child to develop their own passions, their own excitement and their own interests. A lot of children and people have told me that this time, although it is kind of extraordinary and has a terrible side to it, has been a very great bonding experience for them. Parents and children have learned together new skills. We mustn't forget the arts. We mustn't forget creativity and all these other things. So I'd say in a nutshell, we do our best. We find a negotiated position between structure, but we don't want to get into like creating a really bad atmosphere in the home. I think that would not be good news for anybody.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we hand over to Rabbi Herman now? Apparently not.
Right, just to reinforce, or put it in slightly different language, but you know, I would share two principles. Teenagers do best when teenagers buy in. When they buy in, they take responsibility. So in terms of perhaps fleshing out a little bit what Professor Gersch said in terms of negotiation, there is a skill to negotiation such that a teenager buys in. So for example, you might say to them, you've got to do 2 hours work today. I don't mind when you do it. As long as it's done before 9 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night, whatever time works, every time, I don't mind when you do it. When would it work for you? So you've kind of created an expectation, but you've invited a buy-in. And then you can talk. The teenager might say, I'd like to do it this time, that time, the other time. And it is a negotiated settlement at which ultimately they buy in. When they buy in, they feel it's theirs, they take ownership. To quote the book that I had the privilege of co-authoring with Professor Gersch, quick plug here, when we impose, we create resentment. When we empower, we create responsibility. And that's really important. That's principle number one. Wherever we can empower, we create responsibility. Number two is that the relation, we have to remember in our parent-teenager stage, the relationship is everything. And the long-term relationship is everything. We've got to be very, very careful not to win the battle and lose the war. We've got to ask ourselves, long-term, what's this going to do to the relationship? And I hate to say this because it's painful to hear in a certain degree, but it may be worthwhile letting go of the schoolwork and allowing the child to make some of their own mistakes to preserve the relationship. Ultimately, in a year's time, in 2 years' time, even in 5 years' time, when we look back on this period, we want to know that the relationship remained wholesome. And dare I say it, that may even be more important than the GCSE results. In my view, it definitely is. So of course, we've got to try everything that's been suggested, but ultimately what we don't want to do is damage the relationship to achieve a GCSE.
If I may ask the professor and the rabbi, in terms of, so obviously the question was directed at a teenager. If I can bring it down to a younger age as well, in terms of primary school, because I think it's important. What would we say if the primary school child is, let's say year 4, year 3, year 4? is saying, I don't want to do it, I'm not doing my schoolwork, and has said it quite eloquently, like I did, with slightly more energy.
I couldn't agree more with what Rabbi Herman has said. Pleased that he chose me to write the book with him, actually. But I think it's very true. I think that with younger children, to be honest, they may or may not be more acquiescent, but I think it's got to be fun. And I think if we can try and change the lesson a little bit to make it fun, then that would be a good thing. I'd say exactly the same for younger children. Again, explaining what we're doing, why we're doing, but I think we've got to give way on occasion. We've got to give perhaps longer periods of time of rest. And let's not forget that we all do a lot of learning when we're doing activities, when we're actually seen to be resting, when we're actually doing exercise and so on. For younger children, they need even more breaks, even more short, sharp bursts of work, lots and lots of praise and recognition. And it can be quite helpful if there's an extended family, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and so on, that if they are going to learn something new, like tables or something like that, that they phone up some long lost auntie and tell them. They can bore them with the tables or whatever. And actually demonstrating that skill to someone else can be quite helpful. And in addition to that, if it all becomes a little bit intense, there's nothing wrong with using other people outside of the immediate home, but outside of the family as well. But I'd say exactly what Rabbi Herman said. These times will pass. They won't be forever. Children actually go through the whole summer holidays without doing loads of work, and they learn loads of things. So the one thing I wouldn't do is panic about it, but I would try and build in some sort of structure. With younger children, they are very receptive to rewards, both practical rewards, prizes, money, certificates, telling their teacher what they're doing. And some schools are really good at keeping in touch and inviting them to submit things that they've been doing. But we've got to remember that learning isn't just schoolwork stuff. It's also about learning about nature, about relationships, and the things that have been said by my colleagues before, and the arts and humanity itself, which I think is quite an important thing to bear in mind. We have to hold it in perspective.
Anything to add, Rabbi Herman?
Yeah, well, I would only add one point, which is there's nothing wrong either with creating some boundaries as well. That's also important. As parents, we shouldn't be scared of setting some boundaries and saying to a child, actually, you can't use the iPad all day long. You've got to do a certain amount of work first before you can use the iPad. So whilst we want to incentivize and we want to reward and we want to use positivity, there's also nothing wrong with parents setting some ground rules. That's important that we have the confidence in our own authority to be able to set some ground rules in our interaction with our children. So again, we want to choose the route of positivity, but children need to learn that actually there are boundaries within life, and there is important that we take responsibility for what we have to do. And so within that as well, as parents, we've got to be able to set sensible boundaries and have the confidence to be able to carry those through with love and with the appropriate relationship intact.
Brilliant. Okay. The next question, moving into a slightly different area. If I can just remind everyone that if anyone does want to put forward a question, they can do so to the text number, which appears every so often, which is 07444 472 216. There it is again. Or you can just write it in on the chat. No problem at all. Okay, question number 3, and I think we're going to start with Vanessa on this one. So the questioner said, I have 3 children, 5, 7, almost 5, sorry, 7 and 9. I've tried to explain to them what's going on. I'm assuming that means with the current situation, not just what's going on generally. But I feel that to them, the world has become a scary and dangerous place. How can I redress that balance and reassure them? So we'll start with Vanessa on that one.
Thank you. I think that I notice that my children get scared that when my children are scared about the world around them, I often find that I have to look at myself first and ask, oh, am I scared? How did I communicate that to them? You know, it's so easy for me to slip into a space that is fearful or confused, and then it comes through to them in that same way. We're talking about young children. You know, they pick up on the way I see the world. I'm the one who's like at the forefront of teaching them about what's going on in the world, certainly at the moment. So the first place I would look is me and check that I'm teaching from a space where I feel more secure. I feel more comfortable, and I know that I have something to share with them that is useful. So that's the first thing, is not to sort of impose my fear onto them. And the second thing is that I think it's an amazing opportunity to really look as a family where our experience of security really comes from. Because it's an interesting phenomenon if we look at it. Like, we've all experienced things that we think are scary and had a response that is secure and really quite admirably responsive. You know, I mean, I remember once having an intruder in my house, and I couldn't believe my clarity of mind. I wasn't scared. I just had this sort of intelligence that was gifted to me in the moment of how to act. And then there's times when there is nothing to be scared of, and I respond in a really scary way. And we do that as human beings all the time. And that really is worth looking at, because it points to a truth about experience that tells us that actually it's not the circumstances that are scary. There will always be challenging circumstances, there always have been, and there've always been human beings that have responded in a way to those circumstances that is mind-blowing. And they've responded. I mean, look at somebody like Nelson Mandela with what he went through, and he talks about a psychological freedom that he discovered, or Viktor Frankl. And these are extreme cases, but the human being is capable of responding in an incredibly resilient way to extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And I know that I would want my children to know that circumstances will be what they are, and sometimes they're going to be very challenging. But as a human being, I am built to handle life. We all are. That is like our divine gift, that we are able to be responsive to life. And there are times that I will be afraid, because I will lose access to that innate resilience, that innate sort of intelligence that I have moment by moment to be responsive. But it's not the circumstances. Like, I don't have to be, the circumstances are not scary, even though I will sometimes find that I'm in a scary mindset. And when that disappears, I will find myself back to my innate resilience, my innate ability to respond with common sense, or to respond with a security. It's like that security is always inside of me. I might not always experience it, but like the sun never disappears, it's the same concept. My inner security is something that never disappears. And I mean, our children will see it. Our children behave, we can point that out to children in all sorts of neutral times again. So for instance, you know, when I see a child, a young child like them, say, you know, one boy hits another boy, and I see that the other boy doesn't get pulled into being reactive, I could say to that child, wow, that was a really difficult circumstance that you were just in, and I saw it. You didn't let it pull you away from your steady self. Now that's teaching a child about emotional resilience. It's teaching a child that their security comes from inside of them, and it's not dependent on the circumstance. Irrespective of circumstances, we can experience an inner security. Now that's something that I really would want my children to know. Both that it's okay to be afraid, that I'm also afraid, and then I'll come back to myself again and find my own inner security. So I think that's, I feel that what is true is reassuring to us all. If we're constantly a victim of our circumstances, we are doomed, because we are constantly faced with difficult circumstances. But the really wonderful truth is that we are not a victim of our circumstance. You know, nothing can climb inside of me and put a feeling inside of me. Nothing can do that, which is why everybody has a different response to corona. A spider. This morning I had a spider on my head. So one child freaked out, And another child was laughing because they thought it was really funny that mommy had a spider on the head. One child was terrified the spider was on my head. Well, because spiders are not scary. Circumstances are not scary. They're experiencing their mind. Each child and each one of us is always experiencing our mind, moment by moment by moment. And when a child knows that, the circumstance itself does not have power over us. So again, I would want to deal with this at a time when I'm not faced with when I'm faced with a child that is scared. I just want to be with that child and I want to listen. But I want to model a different paradigm when that child, it just within the home generally. I want to come back. Like, I don't know who else has something to add to this, but I feel like there's so much. There's just so much to say.
Can I pick on you?
Sure.
But we are. I'd love to speak about a neutral time, but we're not in a neutral time. We're in a time where the quote unquote crisis is on top of us all the time. So
yeah, but that's not true. You're right. In circumstances, we are in a time of corona and lockdown. But as far as our human experience goes, we have had infinite number of experiences within the four walls of our homes. Every child has, and each one of us as adults has. We've freaked out, we've been calm, we've laughed, we've shouted, we've cried, we've mourned, we've felt optimism and hope. You know, we've played games and sort of laughed till our sides ached. We've had all sorts of experiences because it isn't corona that dictates our experience as human beings. It's what happens to be passing through our mind moment by moment that's dictating our experience as a human being. And the circumstances, go on, the professor wants to say something. But we can't hear you.
When you finished?
No, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, finish your point, and then I'd like to take up one point, develop one point that you've said. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can hear you. I can hear you.
I just want to take up the issue about
that emotionally healthy human beings,
right,
and resilient human beings are human beings that know they are built to handle life no matter what the circumstances are.
Yeah, but can I build on that, because I think they're very important points to create the right atmosphere and the adult being kind of solid. I think from a psychological point of view, though, it's really important to take the child's fears seriously and to listen very directly. I think that everything that's been said is very important about setting the right atmosphere, but we shouldn't reassure the child too quickly, because that's not to listen. We should reassure at the end. But one of the questions I like to ask people with great fears is, what is the worst that could happen? And if one can think of that, one can often think of counteractions to that. The general evidence is that we have to be very honest with children. We should be calm and neutral. But if you look at the science, as Vanessa has said, many of the science itself is quite reassuring for children, but we've got to find the words at different ages. So some children call it, you know, nasty Mr. Virus, and they've got to be safe, they've got to be careful. But I think it's quite reasonable for children to learn a little bit about how they can survive with this and what they should do for their own safety. We do know from the science that their lungs and their whole physiology is actually better for them than for older people, and they've got that on their side. And all the NHS, you know, there's a lot of people out there who are working for us, the doctors, the nurses, all the people. And I think there is a lot, as Vanessa said, there's a lot reassuring, and we need to actually speak specifically about that to children. I think we should limit the negative media talk, and that sometimes you just get critique and criticism and negativity, and stay to the positive facts and reassure. But some children have told me that it's quite helpful to count their blessings and think about some of the things that are happening that are helpful at this time. But the one thing I do think is that we should address the issues directly with them in the language that they can understand, and only end the reassurance at the end once they've said what they're really worried about. Reassurance too early like, oh, you've got nothing to worry about for some children, is almost like saying, just be quiet and don't tell me. And I quite feel passionately about the fact that everybody needs their space to talk about things, even if they think they're silly. There's nothing silly about expressing their concerns, as Vanessa has said, and I think that should be given deep respect and neutral understanding. Oh, by the way, just something, talking about Vanessa's point about everybody's anxious, the definition of a psychotherapist talking to a patient is it's two anxious people talking to each other, just one slightly more anxious than the other. So everybody feels anxious at times.
If I could, we've had a question come in online as well, just to reiterate that I think to kind of nail this point, because I'm not sure if it's been nailed, I'm not sure if it's been completely addressed based on the question, which is, what about when there are actually, what about when children have, let's say, grandparents that are seriously ill, meaning they have talk of ventilators and talk of respirators and things like that. And there is obviously those tragic events happening, tragic circumstances going on. How do we speak to our children about these type of issues and reassure them there? Can I start with Rabbi Herman?
Thank you. I think that honesty in the appropriate language is always the best policy. Children feel reassured when they sense they're getting the truth. When there are unanswered questions, they actually leave feeling less secure. So we have to find the right language to explain it to our children, but actually being honest with them in a sensible way. So I always say that we have to tell the children the truth. We don't have to tell them the whole truth now, but what we tell them now must be wholly true. So God forbid a grandparent is not well, we have to explain the grandparent is not well, and the doctor's doing everything they can to make the grandparent better, and we can daven to Hashem, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem can do anything at any time, and please God, we hope that the grandparent will get better. So I think that children live well when they sense that what they're being told is true, and that's very, very important. So we've got to find the right language, the child appropriate language. And I mean, we have a whole class on this, but also it's very important to only ask the question the child asks, and to answer it in bite-sized pieces. So whilst I absolutely am with the professor in terms of giving them opportunity to express their fears, it's important that we don't introduce our fears when they haven't raised them. And I think sometimes we can introduce speculative fears and create fear in the home unnecessarily. So I think we've got to be honest, we've got to be real, and sometimes we're not necessarily the best person to explain it, because I think if we can explain it in a way that is calm as much as possible, then that's important. Of course, they can see us upset, especially if it's a parent that's at risk or someone close to us that's at risk. That's important that we don't hide our emotions. But sometimes it may take a third party to sit down with the child, explain what's going on in child-friendly language. And I think that I have found in my experience, having addressed some of the questions many times over the years, that children have a way of assimilating information when they sense it's real and then dealing with it. It's when they feel that we're hiding something from them and actually accentuates the fears. As parents, it's often we want to hide it from them because we want to protect them, but actually in our zealousness to protect them, we can underprepare them. So unfortunately, when the situation is, we've got to be real with them in a child-friendly way. But I also think it's important that we need, where there is hope, to give them hope. Not unrealistic hope, but we're believers in Hashem, that Hashem can do anything. So very important to retain that sense of hope, but not promise them false dreams.
Okay. I'm going to move us on to the next, which is that my husband and I differ about the way we should handle the crisis. I'm not going to tell you who's who. I have to tell you. One is much more cavalier and believes we should go and break some of the rules. And I am more cautious. The children have become aware of this difference and are pushing my boundaries, wanting to meet friends in the park, going into people's back gardens. Can the panel suggest how I can handle this, please? And this one, we are starting with Rabbi Herman.
Well, I thought the Queen had sent in the question. but Her Majesty the Queen. So first, let me say one really important point. Within all of this, I mean, it's always important as parents that we invest in our relationship with our spouse. Where there are two people in a home, it's always important that we invest in the relationship with our spouse. Otherwise, we become just parents and no longer a couple. So that is a general principle in terms of a home where there are two parents at home, that we invest in that relationship. That remains true even during this epidemic, during the coronavirus crisis. That we may not be able to have a date night out of the house, but we've got to have some date time in the house. Ideally every day, half an hour or 45 minutes, just time where actually it's time for us as a couple. And it's important that children know about that. And actually that's a fabulous role modeling for them, that they see that we invest in each other. So that, by the way, is a general principle which is vital here as well. And often where we invest in that time, we will be able to resolve issues much more easily. When we don't invest in the relationship, that these issues become more of a problem and are exacerbated. But I would say in this terms of this specific question, so look, I would say that children know that we are different, but it is ideal if we can present a united front, if we can. And that would be the optimum. If we can't agree with each other, at least we should try and sit down and agree a strategy that we can present to the children. So we may not be in agreement, but we could possibly agree a strategy that we feel overall takes into account both of our views and is a best presented strategy to the children. If that fails, then I would say at least the no-no is not to undermine your spouse in front of the children. That's vital. Because when you undermine your spouse, it's highly disrespectful, and you undermine the authority within the home, and you undermine the respect within the home. So, as I said, ideally, we would find agreement. If we can't find agreement, at least we find a strategy that we can present to the children, taking into account our differences and trying to blend them as best as we can. But at least we should not undermine each other in front of the children. That's really important. We may have to agree to disagree and agree to let one parent handle certain situations and another parent handle other situations.
To the professor, handing over to the professor.
To me, that's perfect. I can't add to that. It's just an absolutely phenomenal answer. Just one thing on the specific issue, and it comes to, if you can't agree, we agree to differ. On this one, because there's a matter of safety and legality, I would say that whatever happens in the end, and I totally agree with what Rabbi Herman has said, 100%, that because we are talking about the child wanting to go out into the park, meet with her friends, which is both dangerous and illegal, I think that trumps everything. And if it's a matter of illegality and say the child's in danger, I think that does, the parent that supports that side must win the argument for the sake of the safety of the child.
Okay, Vanessa, do we have anything to add? Just 1 second, we didn't hear.
I think with things like this, there's something comes to mind to me that's very, very general, but is really useful, I think, with conflict in a relationship. Like I always like to remember, what is the relationship for? Why are we in this whole relationship thing at all? And the overriding goal of any relationship, any marriage, really is we're in it because we wanted closeness. That's what we're looking for. And I found it very impactful when I heard somebody say to me once that any conversation is productive. If you have an issue, any conversation is productive, whether the issue is resolved or not. If you find at the end of the conversation, you're closer. And if we resolve the issue in the conversation, but find that we're more distant than we were at the beginning of the conversation, then actually that's an unproductive conversation. And so I guess it's like, if that's the overriding goal, whenever we try and resolve anything, whenever we do anything, if the overriding goal of the interaction in the relationship is, are we being closer? Are we getting closer? Is this serving the goal? Then it's amazing how impactful that is on how many conflicts arise and how much easier it is to resolve conflicts. When I feel close to my husband things that I was really fighting for tend to be, we tend to get very creative with how to resolve them. But if I'm fighting for the thing itself, I find even more, it'll just emerge again at a later date, or even more conflict arises just at a later date. And that one principle, the relationship is for closeness, and that everything is sort of geared towards that, I find it's the most effective sort of compass that I've ever been given to navigate conflict. So I mean, it really just is just an added point to what Rabbi Herman said.
We're running.
Can I say one more thing? Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
I also think differences are great. Like, sometimes I think we resist the fact that most families, most couples find that they parent or have different opinions on things. It's not the majority that are parenting in the same way. And I think that if that is handled gracefully, it can be so enriching for children. A cavalier approach might be very difficult to handle at this time, but is very useful at another time. We could call it like a nice chill. I bet you that person brings in a very light, lovely energy that can sometimes the very disciplined person might be the right way to go, as the professor said, in this situation, but can also be a challenge in other situations. And if the differences between couples and the way we approach life are embraced, and we know it's okay to be different, it's like, and they're handled with grace within the home, then it can only enrich our children to see so many different traits, and secondly, a couple that is able to navigate differences with a gracefulness. So I just think that when we stop resisting that we do it differently, and we embrace we do it differently, we come at it with a whole new respect for each other that is helpful.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Now, without trying to inflate anyone's ego too much, but I just want to read you some of the comments that we've got. Some of the comments we've got in. So we've had comments such as, "Wishing I had to listen to some of this years ago. Great panel. Thanks from Manchester, from Shlomi, from Eleanor." We've even had a Rabbi Bazak is fantastic. I mean, Rabbi Herman is fantastic. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Hold on, let me just. Yes, Rabbi Herman is amazing. Sorry, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So one final question, and let's, if I can push you to keep your answers as brief as possible, because I don't want to overrun. So my daughter has had a bat mitzvah celebrations postponed for the time being. Understandably, she's extremely disappointed. All of her close friends have had their celebrations. We offered to reschedule post-lockdown, but she says it will be too late and pathetic, since everyone will have moved on. Firstly, can you give me some ideas to help her? And secondly, she is also questioning how God could want her to not have such a bat mitzvah. Two quite tough questions. I think we'll start with Rabbi Herman on that one.
First of all, I want to thank my wife for sending in that text message. That was very sweet of her indeed. It's a tough question. Again, to reinforce the point that Professor Gersch has said so many times, and in our collaboration together emphasize, listening is vital. In one of our five parenting tools, no one can hear until they've been heard. No one can hear until they've been heard. And if a person hasn't been heard, they do one of two things. Either they shout louder or they clam up. So listening is absolutely vital. And listening means wholesome listening without necessarily, I would say without proposing a solution. And often when we listen to a child, especially a teenager, and we listen properly and listen well, then once they've been heard, they will often propose their own solution and be remarkably creative in so doing. So I would say first and foremost is to listen without proposing a solution. And then when the child is in a more receptive place, then one could discuss options. When it's not quite as contentious or emotional, then they can discuss options. That would be strategy number one in terms of handling their emotional well-being. And often we want to rush to propose a solution and the child isn't ready for it and may not be ready for it at this point in time. In terms of how can God allow this, that's a very tough question, a theological question, great question for a 13-year-old. Personally, as a rabbi, I find that it isn't productive to give logical answers to theological questions that are asked in a place of emotional vulnerability. So again, I would endorse the question, and I would actually say that we don't always understand how God runs the world. At a time when the child is more receptive, then we could discuss how God sees a bigger picture that we don't always see. We have a little game that we produce for seed. You can produce it yourselves. To take a photograph from the internet, cover it up 90%, leaving a small hole, ask the child to identify what the picture is. It's difficult to identify until you uncover it. The message is that we see the whole, H-O-L-E, and God sees the whole, W-H-O-L-E. Now, when a child is in a place where they can hear this concept, it's a concept to share. There's often that God will see a bigger picture, a context we can't see, a life's journey that we can't view at this point in time, and there will be good that will come out of this, even if it may take us years to realize what that good is. You could talk about what a child can learn from that, etc. Time is short, so we can't elaborate, but that would be the principle of that. Don't try and give an answer when they're emotionally vulnerable. At the time when they're not, you can introduce some of these deeper concepts in a child-friendly way. Rabbi, Zach, we cannot hear you.
That's what happens when you mute your microphone. If you, Professor, can you add, is there anything you want to add to that?
But I just really wanted to add one ending point to that. There was a wonderful man called Viktor Frankl, who was in the camps as part of the Holocaust, and he decided, even in the camps as a prisoner, that he would become a top psychiatrist in the world, which actually he eventually did become. And he developed this concept, which he called tragic optimism. And that is, from every tragedy, however terrible, sometimes something amazing, positive comes out. From my own experience, I think, and all of our experience, I bet we can think of many times when we've thought we've had a loss and it turns out to be a benefit. And I often had students training as psychologists, and they would phone me and say, I'm really upset because I haven't got a job. And I'd say, hold on a minute, think of tragic optimism. And sure enough, without exception, within a short period of time, a better job came along that had they taken the first job, they would have actually lost that opportunity. But on a personal story, and I hope my daughter doesn't mind me saying this, but many years ago, she was doing her A-level, and I came home and she was doing the classics, and she had written an essay which had taken her ages, and it was on the wonderful topic of Greek agricultural farming techniques in the 5th century BCE. And this was the most boring essay that she could ever have done. She hated it. And she spent about a week typing this up. And when I came home, she said, and she was in tears, she said that the computer has frozen and it won't go up and it won't go down and it won't let me print, nothing, absolutely stopped. And I said, don't worry, I'll try and help you. And I pressed a button and the whole thing disappeared completely, forever, kaput, gone. You can imagine what I was called by my daughter. So I came up with this ingenious idea that what I would do was I would buy someone to write the essay, and who of all people could do it but only her. So I hired her to rewrite the essay, and she charged me an extortionate amount to do it. I think it's the highest paid person who's ever written her own essay. And I don't know how far she forgave me for that. But roll on a couple of months, the A-level came up, and what was the first question in the A-level paper? It was this one. And had she written it out twice, because she'd written it out twice, she knew it by heart, which she'd previously hated it. And incidentally, she got an A in classics. And I'm really taking not the blame, but the credit for that, because I did her the disservice and caused her the tragedy, came out tragic optimism. So that's a personal story. But I think many of you here will be listening and thinking, you know what, this happened to me. I thought it was the end of the world. And actually, it was an opportunity. And I went into something rather different. So I would hold on to that and agree with everything that Rabbi Herman said about the bat mitzvah. Eventually there'll be a time to think about other things, other holidays, other trips, other ways of doing it. but I just hold that tragic optimism idea in my mind. I think it's very helpful philosophy to hold on to.
Okay, if I can, we have had other questions in, but I think we'll have to wrap it up for this evening. Maybe we'll do another panel at another point. I just want to thank the panel very, very much. For me, this was particularly interesting. Lots of questions were actually very, very relevant to me. And I think there's a tremendous amount that's given us food for thought there. Just one more promotion of the book, co-authored by Rabbi Herman and Professor Gersch, Everyday Parenting for Everyday Parents. We in Seed call it the Bible. No, but we call it the Bible, and it's extremely practical and very well founded in educational psychology and in Torah. So if anyone wants to get the book, that's available on Amazon, as you can see at the bottom. Thank you very much for joining us, both all Rabbi Herman, Professor Gersch, and Mrs. Broder, Mrs. Vanessa Broder. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate your wisdom. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, everyone. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. If you send in the questions to that phone number again, we will try and get back to you with some sort of response. Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I don't actually know how to turn it off.